What if the darkest period of your life wasn't a breakdown? What if it was an initiation? Right now, somewhere in the world, millions of people are lying awake at 3 a.m. feeling like everything they built is quietly falling apart. Their relationships feel hollow. Their ambitions feel meaningless. The version of themselves they worked so hard to become suddenly feels like a costume they can no longer wear. They call therapists. They search for answers. They wonder if something is permanently wrong with them. But here is what no one tells them. What they are experiencing has a name. It has a map. And for thousands of years, the most advanced mystery schools on earth considered it the most sacred passage a human being could walk through. They called it the dark night of the soul. And the reason modern society never warns you about it, the reason no school, no doctor, no self-help book ever prepares you, is because understanding it would make you impossible to control. Today, we pull back the curtain. Let's go deeper. The term dark night of the soul comes from a 16th century Spanish mystic named St. John of the Cross. He wrote a poem and then a commentary describing a spiritual journey so painful, so disorienting, that the only honest metaphor he could find was darkness. Not metaphorical darkness, not feeling a little sad. Total darkness. The kind where you cannot see your hand in front of your face. The kind where every landmark you use to navigate life has disappeared. But here is what is critical to understand. John of the Cross was not describing a disease. He was not describing failure. He was describing a transformation so profound that the old self had to be completely dismantled before the new one could emerge. Ancient Egypt encoded this process into the myth of Osiris, the god who was torn apart, scattered across the earth, and then reassembled into something greater than before. The resurrection was not possible without the destruction. The alchemists of medieval Europe called it the nigredo, the blackening, the first and most essential stage of turning base metal into gold. You cannot skip it. You cannot rush it. The darkness is the process. The Sufis wrote about fana, the annihilation of the ego self, as the doorway to union with the divine. The Buddhist tradition speaks of the dissolution of the constructed self as the very threshold of awakening. Every serious spiritual tradition on earth has recognized this passage. Every single one. And yet modern culture, with its optimization apps, its productivity culture, its obsession with fixing everything in 30 days, has no language for it, no framework, no map. So when it happens to you, you assume something has gone terribly wrong. That assumption is the trap. Let's go deeper. The dark night does not arrive randomly. It is not punishment. It is not evidence that the universe has abandoned you. It arrives because you outgrew a version of yourself, and that version is no longer willing to let go quietly. Think about what your identity actually is. It is a structure, a carefully constructed architecture built from your beliefs about who you are, what you deserve, what the world means, and what your place in it is. That structure took years to build. It was assembled from childhood experiences, from relationships, from the roles you were handed, and eventually accepted as your own. And for a while, it worked. It kept you safe. It gave you direction. But structures have load limits. At some point, through loss, through failure, through the slow accumulation of questions that won't stop asking themselves, the old structure begins to crack. And here is what the mystery schools understood that modern psychology is only beginning to catch up to. The cracking is not the problem. The cracking is the solution. Carl Jung, one of the most sophisticated psychological minds of the 20th century, spent his career mapping the territory that mystics had already charted. He called this process individuation, the movement from the constructed social self, what he called the persona, toward the deeper, authentic self that exists beneath all the layers of conditioning. He believed the dark night was not a pathology. It was the psyche's way of forcing a confrontation with everything that had been buried, denied, or suppressed. Everything you refused to feel. Everything you were told not to be. Everything that was cut off in childhood to make you acceptable to the world around you. The darkness brings it all back. And the system, the schools, the institutions, the media, the pharmaceutical industry, has a vested interest in you, not understanding this. Because a person who understands that their darkness is a transformation is a person who moves through it. A person who believes their darkness is a malfunction is a person who stays managed, medicated, and dependent. Let's go deeper. So how do you know if you are in one? Because the dark night is not the same as depression, though it can look similar from the outside. It is not the same as grief, though grief can trigger it. It is not a crisis of circumstance. It is a crisis of identity. Here are the signs the ancient traditions described, and that modern researchers in transpersonal psychology have documented in thousands of cases. The first sign: nothing that used to satisfy you satisfies you anymore. The career you worked for feels hollow. The relationships that once fulfilled you feel somehow distant. The things you used to want, the status, the validation, the comfort, suddenly seem like they belong to someone else's story. You can't force yourself to care about them the way you once did. And that terrifies you. The second sign: a profound sense of being between two worlds. You no longer fully belong to your old life, but you haven't yet arrived at the new one. You exist in a strange middle space, like standing in a doorway, unable to go back into the room you came from, but not yet able to see what's on the other side. The third sign: the questions won't stop. Who am I, really, beneath all the roles I play? What do I actually believe, separate from what I was taught? What is this life actually for? These questions used to be easy to ignore. Suddenly, they are impossible to silence. The fourth sign: old relationships begin to feel misaligned. Not because those people did anything wrong, but because you are changing internally, and the connections built around the old version of you begin to feel like clothes you have outgrown. Some of them fall away, and that loss is real, and it hurts. The fifth sign: an inexplicable sense of grief that has no specific object. You are mourning something, but you cannot name what. And that nameless grief is one of the most disorienting feelings a human being can experience. If you are experiencing these things, or have experienced them, you are not broken. You are being rebuilt, the hidden architecture. Let's go deeper. Here is what the mystery schools encoded in their initiatory rituals, and what modern science is now confirming. The human psyche does not grow by addition alone. It also grows by subtraction, by dissolution, by the deliberate destruction of what no longer serves the deeper self. The Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, attended by Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, involved a ritual descent into darkness and a symbolic death before the initiate was reborn with new understanding. The ritual encoded what the initiates were meant to experience internally. You must go down before you can go up. The shamanic traditions of indigenous cultures worldwide describe the same pattern. The shaman's calling begins not with a vision of power, but with a breakdown, an illness, a crisis, a shattering of the ordinary self. It is only through that shattering that the shaman gains the capacity to move between worlds. Quantum physics now offers a language for what the ancients described symbolically. Ilya Prigogine, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on dissipative structures, demonstrated that complex systems must pass through chaos and apparent dissolution before reorganizing at a higher level of order. In other words, breakdown is a necessary precondition for breakthrough, not metaphorically, structurally, at the level of physical law. Your psyche is not exempt from this law. When the old structure of identity can no longer hold the pressure of your growth, it must dissolve. And that dissolution feels from the inside exactly like dying. But it is not dying, it is becoming. What the system doesn't want you to know. Let's go deeper. Here is the part they never teach you. The dark night of the soul is not a crisis to be fixed. It is a transmission to be received. But the system, the entire architecture of modern society, is designed around one assumption: that psychological discomfort is a malfunction, that pain is an error, that darkness is an emergency to be resolved as quickly as possible. This assumption serves the system perfectly, because a person who understands the dark night as a transformation becomes harder to manage. They stop outsourcing their authority to external experts. They stop seeking quick fixes. They stop consuming solutions to a problem that isn't actually a problem. They begin, instead, to trust the process of their own becoming. The ancient initiatory cultures understood something that our culture has almost entirely forgotten: that the most important passages in a human life require darkness, that wisdom cannot be downloaded, that depth cannot be purchased, that the soul must be broken open before it can hold something real. The Hermetic traditions encoded this in the phrase solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, break down and rebuild. It was not just a metaphor, it was a description of how consciousness actually evolves. The Kabbalah describes the same movement through the concept of tzimtzum, the divine withdrawal that creates the space in which creation becomes possible. The darkness is not the absence of light. It is the space in which a new light can be born. And here is what makes this even more extraordinary. The research of psychologists like Stanislav Grof and the documented experiences of thousands of individuals who have moved through what he called spiritual emergencies consistently shows that people who pass through the dark night fully, without suppressing it, without bypassing it, emerge with a fundamentally different relationship to fear, a depth of compassion that was not previously accessible, a clarity about what actually matters, and an unshakable sense of identity that no external circumstance can dismantle. That is what the darkness was building all along. How to move through it. Let's go deeper. So if the dark night is real, and it is a passage rather than a problem, then the question becomes, how do you move through it? Not how do you end it quickly. How do you move through it? Fully, consciously, in a way that allows the transformation to complete itself. The first principle the ancient traditions all agree on: stop fighting the darkness. The single most common mistake people make when entering the dark night is treating it as an enemy. They exhaust themselves trying to return to the version of their life that no longer exists. They try to force enthusiasm for things that have already ceased to resonate. They perform normalcy, while internally dismantling. This is not courage. This is resistance. And resistance prolongs the passage. The Taoist concept of wu wei, effortless action, or the wisdom of not forcing, applies perfectly here. The dark night has its own intelligence. It is moving you toward something. Fighting it is like fighting the tide. The second principle, create stillness. The dark night brings material to the surface that your busy life kept submerged. The loss of your former life's momentum, as terrifying as it feels, is also creating the conditions for something to be heard that could never be heard before. The mystics who documented the dark night most precisely, John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, Teresa of Avila, all emphasized the same practice. Be still, not passive, still. Allow the inner material to surface. Sit with the discomfort without immediately reaching for a distraction. This is not natural. Everything in modern culture tells you to fill the silence. But the silence is where the transmission is. The third principle, trust the intelligence of the process. This is the hardest one because it requires you to hold a belief that feels completely counterintuitive while you are inside the darkness. That what is happening is not random. That the dissolution is purposeful. That something in you, something deeper than the conscious personality, knows exactly what it is doing. Every tradition we have discussed, from the Eleusinian mysteries to the Sufi path to the Jungian framework, points to the same understanding. The self that is being dismantled is not the whole of you. It is a layer. And beneath it is something that has been waiting, patiently, sometimes painfully, for the layer to come down. The fourth principle, reach for depth, not escape. Not every source of comfort is equal during a dark night. Some forms of comfort genuinely support the passage. Deep conversations, time in nature, creative expression, contemplative practice, connection with people who have walked their own darkness. These things work with the process. Other forms of comfort work against it. Constant stimulation, numbing, performance, the frantic maintenance of a life that has already outgrown you. These temporarily relieve the discomfort, but extend the darkness, because they prevent the transformation from completing. The question to ask in each moment is not, does this make me feel better? The question is, does this help me move through, or does it help me avoid the other side? Let's go deeper, because here is the part the initiatory traditions kept as their most closely guarded secret. The dark night ends. Not because you fixed anything, not because you forced your way out. It ends because the transformation it was carrying completes itself. And what emerges on the other side is not the same person who entered. This is what the resurrection mythologies were encoding. Osiris reassembled, but he was no longer the same Osiris. He became something more. He became the ruler of a different domain, not the world of living men, but something deeper. The person who moves through a genuine dark night of the soul reports the same thing in culture after culture, in century after century. The fear of death diminishes, not because life has become comfortable, but because the experience of identity has deepened beyond what can be taken away. The need for external validation dissolves, not as a philosophy adopted intellectually, but as a lived reality. Something has been found internally that no external approval can either give or take. The relationship to suffering transforms. It does not disappear, but it is no longer the same dense, meaningless weight it once was. It becomes something you can hold differently. And perhaps most powerfully, a capacity for presence opens that was never available before. Because presence requires a self secure enough to actually show up fully, without armor, without performance. And the dark night, for all its devastation, forges exactly that. The mystery schools were not teaching people to avoid the dark. They were teaching them to descend consciously, navigate with knowledge, and return transformed. That is the initiation they protected for thousands of years. And now you know. If you are inside the dark night right now, if you recognized yourself in anything we uncovered today, I want to leave you with this. What is falling apart is not your life. It is the version of your life that could no longer carry you forward. And what feels like destruction is actually the most purposeful thing that has ever happened to you. The universe does not waste its initiations. You were not sent into the darkness because something went wrong. You were sent because something is being built. Something that could not be built any other way. Stop waiting for it to be over. Start learning to navigate it. Because on the other side of this passage is a version of yourself that the person you are today cannot yet fully imagine. Trust the darkness. It knows where it is going. If this reached something in you, leave a comment below. We read everyone. And if someone you know is walking through their own dark night right now, share this with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer someone is a map. We'll see you in the next one.